Hello everyone, welcome to today's Wednesday workshop here in the Power Up Your Innate Potential group. So excited to be here with you today. For those of you who are joining me for the first time who don't know me, my name is Dranitsaris-Hilliard, and I'm one of the co-founders here behind the group, one of the individuals behind the content and all of the information that we share, all aimed and all with our goal in mind of helping you to power up your innate potential. Today, we are talking about narcissists and narcissism. It's always such a great topic. It's always such a great conversation starter. Whenever we bring this up, people are often come to us with lots of examples from everyday life. And that's really the focus of our conversation today, is how narcissism plays out in our everyday life. And so why it's really important for us to understand it, understand what it's all about, so we can learn to navigate in and around all of that. You know, all of the time we hear people make these comments like, what a narcissist, can you even believe their behavior? And we hear that, right? I'm sure all of you have heard that as well. And if you're here joining me live and have some comments and some thoughts that you want to share, just remember that you can post them in the feed down below. So it is so common, right? It is so common for us to experience narcissistic behavior, and not just in others, but also in ourselves. And sometimes we might not always connect up with that. So this workshop here today is all about how common narcissistic behavior is, how we see it and experience it in our everyday lives, because we all have defenses, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to talk too about that overuse, that tendency to overuse and to apply the narcissistic label all of the time, and some of the challenges behind using that label and not really understanding what it is that we're looking at and what we're observing and experiencing in others. The other thing I want you to understand as we come out of this session here today is what are some of the differences between narcissistic personality disorder and actually narcissistic self-protective behavior, what we're going to focus a little bit more on. They're not the same. They are not the same. And people tend to lump them together, and that can be problematic for us because we start to look at things as being unchangeable when we put them into the category of a personality disorder as opposed to recognizing it as a defensive or a self-protective behavior. So why does it matter? Why does it matter for any of us to understand narcissism? Why do we want to talk about this? If you've been to our new YouTube channel, Dranitsaris-Hilliard is the place to go. Our new YouTube channel is full of some of our content around dealing with narcissistic behavior in organizations, tips for dealing with them, how to develop them. And again, so why is it important? Well, because they're there. We run into and experience this behavior everywhere. It's not just in organizations. It's in our relationships, our personal lives. It's in our family members. We can even experience it in our children, in our parents, you name it. Narcissistic behavior is, again, we always talk about this from that lens of normal and natural, because it's a defense. But why is it important? Well, firstly, there is a tendency to blame bad behavior that someone is demonstrating or somebody is acting out of on a person being a narcissist, instead of effectively dealing with it and recognizing it as something that we can deal with, especially when we're talking about narcissistic behavior from that self-protective lens, as opposed to the true personality disorder, which is a very, very small percentage of the folks that are out there. What's also important to understand about narcissism and why we want to talk about it and engage with you around it is that when we don't understand it, when we don't understand the root of it, when we don't understand why people are behaving through that narcissistic lens, it keeps us believing that we actually have to adapt, that we have to give into them, that we end up feeling powerless in that relationship or within that dynamic, as though somehow they've got the power because they are responding with that narcissistic defense. The other thing is that when we really understand narcissism from that place of being able to know it, recognize it, name it accurately, it actually stops us from investing excessive time and energy into people and into relationships with certain people who are only capable of having one-sided relationships. So if you're like me, you might have been in relationships with those that use the narcissistic defenses or self-protective approach, and you get sucked into trying to change them. You get sucked into sort of that place of investing time and energy and figuring out how to make it work. And if I just do this or if I just do that, it will all be okay. Instead, when we start to look at narcissistic behavior and narcissistic self-protective behavior objectively, it actually frees us up and again gives us that power. Gives us that power to step back in to really being able to direct ourselves and to lead ourselves through that. So what are some of the things you're going to get from joining me here today? And I'm so excited, those that are able to join me live, or if you're catching this on the replays that we offer, again, on our YouTube channel or elsewhere, you might be picking up a snippet of this here or there. What are you going to get from listening to this? Well, first of all, when we understand the narcissistic self-protective behavior, when we start to be able to see it and recognize it within our own lives, again, personally or professionally, we're actually better able and better equipped to deal with it and not take it personally. And that's a really, really important piece of the takeaway from this, is starting to be able to recognize when this behavior is being directed at you, that ability to depersonalize. It will also help you as we go through this, just learn how to reflect on some of your reactions that you have to narcissistic behavior, starting to see what does it trigger in you and what is your reactive pattern or defensive pattern that gets triggered out, and what can you do differently, or what response do you want to choose that would be more productive and again, leave you feeling like you're in the driver's seat, leave you feeling like you've got the power and you've got the ability to really make a difference within that. And your experience of it. It might not change their behavior, but your experience of it. And most importantly, last but not least, by going through the learning today, we really want to help you to stop feeling victimized by narcissistic self-protective behavior. Beautiful, right? That ability to be able to really detach, not just depersonalize, but not look at yourself as being victimized by them, but really being able to understand where that behavior is coming from and generate that separation that we want. Okay? So first I want to start off by making sure that we're all on the same page when we think about narcissistic behavior and what we mean in particular by narcissistic self-protective behavior, because I make that distinction all the way along. We have a bunch of videos and that they've been up for years around narcissistic behavior in the workplace on our YouTube channel. And it's amazing the number of people that will comment and say they should just be fired. You know, you can't do anything about them. You know, they shouldn't be here. They shouldn't be allowed to do these things. Narcissistic self-protective behavior is what we see in most people, okay? So we're not talking about the personality disorder. We're really talking about that pattern of behavior that gets triggered when someone is feeling the need to protect themselves. It's a set of defenses, okay? So again, thinking of that word, they're using it to defend themselves, to protect themselves, okay? And it's not the same thing as actually having the narcissistic personality disorder from the true definition and diagnosis perspective. But we do tend to lump them in together. We don't necessarily think in our minds, okay, is that the personality disorder or is that just a defensive strategy? But that's our first step here in really understanding it and trying to make that distinction. And I'll talk to you about a couple of the ways in which we really start to recognize whether it's one versus the other. But when we lump them in together, we actually end up pathologizing our bosses, our friends, our family members, our spouses, as opposed to being able to look at it through that lens of trying to understand the behavior and then how do we respond to it. Usually, when we call somebody a narcissist, it's just a way of judging their behavior, right? When they insist upon having things their way. Can you relate to that? Do you know some narcissists or some people that you would say use that narcissistic defensive strategy? They want it their way, my way or the highway. And they're often just plain unconscious about the impact that their behavior is having on the people around them. They don't see themselves as doing anything wrong. They don't see themselves as, sort of not being, or they don't see themselves as being acting out of their defenses or being self-protective, right? But this is how they lead out and they communicate out into their world. Now, narcissistic personality disorder is very different. Okay. And so what we're talking about here and what's important to understand about it is the difference is when we talk about those who actually have narcissistic personality disorder, have been diagnosed, and they actually have that underlying pathology, they have no choice than to behave the way that they do. Okay. That is a fixed thing for them. It is unchangeable, and there is nothing that they can do about it. It is a mental disorder. And those who live with it and are sick with it and suffer from it are actually stuck, literally stuck in that inflated image that they have of themselves. Not those with narcissistic defenses, though, and all of us have them, those with narcissistic defenses and those that use narcissistic defenses, they were using those behaviors and those strategies either to cope, right, with what's going on, to get our own ways, or as a means to the end, or because we want to be seen in a particular way. But again, it's all about how we cope, how we protect, and how we defend ourselves. It's a choice. It might not be a conscious choice, but it is a choice. But those with the narcissistic defenses, again, because we all have them, we all pull them out when we're feeling threatened, okay? So this isn't just something that's unique to individuals. And remember, if you think about it from a development perspective, we all go through that narcissistic phase of development when we are much younger. But though we are capable, even though we might use, or even though other people around us might use those narcissistic defenses, they are capable of empathy. They can reflect on their behavior, and they can actually strive towards changing and developing so that their relationships are not negatively impacted. Okay. So it's a developmental piece, as we always talk about here in Power Up Your Innate Potential, is that understanding of things as a developmental gap. And we want to build the awareness around it. We want to look at those strategies for developing. Now, as we talk about it today, the focus is a little bit more in recognizing those narcissistic defenses in others and thinking about what can we do, right? What can we do differently? How can we respond differently to those behaviors? And what are some of the things that we can do to take back our power and ultimately, as I said earlier, not feel victimized by those that are using those defenses? So let's look at some common examples, because of course, getting into the stories about this is always, sort of beneficial, because it really does illustrate what we're dealing with and what we're trying to address here. Okay. Now, again, I bet that some of you have some really great stories on this, and we look forward to hearing them. Always happy to have you posting your comments below, sharing your stories, letting us know your comments or your questions about anything that's here in this video. Again, whether you're joining us here live or if you are watching it on the replay on our YouTube channel. We always respond to all of your comments and your questions, and so we look forward to hearing from you, our audience, because we really look forward to that opportunity to be able to engage with you and to be able to support you in your growth and development. Okay. So if you think about it, that, our defenses get triggered, right? And it is a fact in our daily lives. And so others that we are interacting with, again, whether it's at work or at home, are in a similar situation. And so what we're really talking about here are those that their go-to is that defensive, that narcissistic defenses, self-protective approach, right? So think about, you may know someone like this. It's the person who has everyone walking around on eggshells, right? Because you just don't know the mood that they are going to be in and how they are going to react. I remember one of my bosses early on, we always had this sort of warning system, and his assistant would put a little sticker up on the top corner of her monitor, green, yellow, or red, that would alert all of us around him as to the mood that he was in. That was narcissistic defenses in action. So we knew that not a good day to approach him. If his defenses were up, not a good day. He was more likely to react, to yell, to be, make condescending remarks, or to be devaluing, or just be difficult in us trying to get a decision or to resolve something with him. And yet other times he would be, great, a wonderful boss. Unfortunately for us, it wasn't all that often, but it did happen. So this was, again, indicative of the fact that it is a self-protective system, and they do have the ability to shift their behavior. And there are those individuals, again, narcissistic defenses, they'll stop talking to you, maybe even ignore you because of something you said or something you did, and you're left not knowing what it is, right? What did I do? And there's no way to resolve it. So again, that's the power of that narcissistic defense, because it really leaves the other person feeling like they have no power and they're being victimized. My ex-mother-in-law is a great example of someone in my personal life who used the narcissistic defenses. Anytime that someone was doing something or talking about something that she did not like, she did not agree with, she didn't think was the right thing for them to be doing, she just would tell them that it was an effing stupid idea, or what are you effing stupid? Nobody's going to agree with that. That's the wrong thing to do. And that was when we knew, in hindsight at the time, it was a bit of a shock to me because I didn't grow up in an environment where people talk like that. But now looking back at it through that lens of narcissistic defense, that's very much where it was coming from. It was self-protective, and because she was worried about how it would look on her if we did these things with our lives, if we made these choices, if we had our wedding at that venue. It was all came back to the impact on her, because all of our decisions in her mind were a reflection on her. And that's, again, that narcissistic position, right? They take something that was about us, it was about us, our decisions and our lives, and made it about her. And that was the reaction that we got. And we would feel devalued, obviously, and she would tell us that we couldn't do it and that it wasn't okay. And so again, you start to feel really powerless, as though we have to adapt and follow. And instead what happens is you just want to spend less time with those individuals, right? And so that can be really problematic in the relationship, obviously, right? And so I can go on, right? And we have these stories, these observations where somebody is coming out at that lens where they're vilifying or they're idealizing you. Like one day, my mother's a great example of this, where when she's working out of her narcissistic self-protective system, people get classed into two categories. You're either idealized and up on the pedal, or you're vilified and you're the worst human being that there is, and there are all these things that are wrong with you. And there's nothing in between. And so everybody is great and everybody's wonderful. And then the next thing you know, well, I'm not talking to them and they did this and they did that. That's that narcissistic self-protective, right? It's like it's always about them. They're always doing something wrong. And that there isn't that ability to really connect and build that relationship when someone is 100% of the time living out of those defenses. And you have to learn, how do you respond and how do you react and how do you engage in those sorts of examples. Now, personal life, easy to pick up. Let's talk about it at work, because interestingly enough, at work, in leaders in particular, we see narcissistic defenses show up in two very, very different ways. And one of them is autocratic. And that's what we're used to when we think about narcissistic behavior, the my way or the highway, the yelling, the belligerent, the devaluing, all of those sorts of pieces. But there's also the permissive side of it, where, the individual, again, in that narcissistic defense of trying to make themselves look good as though everything's great and everything's okay, being excessively permissive and tolerant of things, okay? Now, one of the ways in which we recognize narcissistic defenses is when a client talks to us, and we had this conversation recently with one of our clients where they were saying everything was great and everything will be fine and we'll just bring this new person in and everything will magically work out, right? That's that dismissiveness of actual concerns about people's actual emotions or experiences, as though, and they often will talk as though they think they know better about what someone is going to experience versus what they might experience, right? And so they have no flexibility to take in the fact that there are some actual concerns that perhaps need to be resolved. Another example is where we have a leader that we work with that, again, narcissistic defenses. He's really, really struggling in his leadership role. He's struggling to get a handle on his team around what he needs to deliver, his ability to really impact and drive things forward. And so his narcissistic defense is going into pointing fingers at every other area of the organization and calling into question what they're doing, saying that they're doing things wrong, that they're, that all of these other areas are so broken. And again, it's a way of pushing the attention off of his area because he's doing such a great job of letting everybody know where all of the fires actually are, that nobody's actually looking at his area. So again, narcissistic defenses, they come up in all kinds of different ways. And so the people that are dealing with that, as we talk to them about it, It's like you have to depersonalize it. This is not about you. This is someone who is feeling very afraid as to what is happening in his own place, his own role, his own status in the organization. And so when you start seeing someone doing what he's doing, it just makes a ton of sense that you would be, recognizing that as narcissistic defenses at play. Okay. The other one, the flip side, as I said earlier, there's the autocratic, there's the permissive. Everyone's so great. I have this open door policy. No one has any issues. I'm all things to all people. It's that narcissistic self-deception, right? So again, as a defense, I'm not going to look at things objectively. I'm not going to assess things honestly. I'm not going to test reality or ask for feedback because everything's great and everything's wonderful. As long as I let everyone do what it is that they want to do, we have no issues, right? So this is the flip side. It's still narcissistic because it's self-serving, right? It is about them. It's about them and what they're interested in and what's going to make them feel safe and comfortable. And it's an illusion. And it is just as destructive to the organization as the more autocratic narcissistic behavior because you don't get results. You tolerate all kinds of poor performance. I have one client who's in this situation where they're dealing with someone who uses narcissistic defenses. And so they get pushed into their permissive narcissistic defenses and nothing happens and nothing changes other than the fact that they start complaining about the person, even though they're the leader, they're in charge. They're the ones that actually have the power to do something to correct the behavior of the other individual. But again, because they're working out of their narcissistic self-protective system, they end up doing nothing but being really, really permissive. Okay. Everyone has issues. That's a fact of life. Some employees bug us. Some employees frustrate us. And so not being honest about that, not being objective about that, again, all indications of that narcissistic defenses. So it pops up in different places. It pops up in different ways, depending on the personality style of the individual, depending on some of the aspects of the situation or the context that they are working in. So we can't necessarily change directly, always the use of narcissistic defenses. But what we can do is really think about and reflect on our reactions to narcissistic behavior. Most of us get pulled into trying to change the narcissistic behavior in relationships. I have one of my clients who's been working with a narcissistic CEO for years. He uses the narcissistic defenses for years. And she still, to this day, despite everything that she has done, still holds out the hope that if she just says the right thing, does the right thing, brings the right thing forward, then somehow it's going to change. Okay. So that's her own, getting caught in her own self-protective pattern there. But the fact is we can't change them. We can't change. That's their development. That's their developmental gap. They need to work on it. And only they can make the decision to close that gap, to stop using or to become more aware of their use of these narcissistic self-protective behaviors and start to be able to catch themselves and shift themselves out. But what we can do is we can respond differently to their behavior. We can stop defending ourselves against their attacks. We can stop, sort of defending ourselves around their devaluations. We can stop becoming emotional because all that does is feeds their need for power and attention. Okay. So when we ratchet it up in response to them, that again, it feeds them, right? And that is not useful to us. So we want to really think about, and this is some questions for you to consider when you think about the narcissistic defenses in your life, you want to think about your reactions. So fight, flight, freeze, normal, natural, what immediately is going to get triggered. But we need to stop going into one of those and instead decide, do we want to stay in this relationship? Do we need to set up some boundaries around this relationship so we're not subjecting ourselves to that vilification? And can we depersonalize their behavior so we don't really get stuck in it? So let me tell you a couple of success stories around it. And I'm going to start with one for me because, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up with a mother who's very much lives out of this self-protective approach, these defenses. And even today, with everything that I know, I still catch myself times when she's off on a rant and I know the facts are wrong and I know this is just her, narcissistic defenses where she's creating a whole story, making this whole story up because, to make herself be positioned as a victim because that's where she happens to like to go. And keeping myself out of moving into arguing, moving into, challenging some of the things that I know are just flat out inaccuracies, and instead shifting into empathy. Oh, that sounds it's really difficult. That's a bit of a struggle. Oh, I didn't know that. That's a different perspective than I had. So I use these, and I don't get emotionally invested in being right. I don't try and, change what she's talking about. I simply stay in that conversation because she's my mother and I want to stay in a relationship with her and it's important to me. And so this is where we're thinking about, again, some of these strategies that we can employ. Is it always easy? No. Do I congratulate myself sometimes when I get off the phone and I manage to get through it without saying some of the things that I really wanted to say? For sure, because that's a win for me, because that's about me. That's about my development, because I don't get triggered when she moves into those places. Another success story we had from a client, the one I was telling you earlier, who for years and years and years has been working with a boss who does definitely practice the narcissistic defenses. And he started to yell at her, which he has done many, many times over the years. And she said, no, you can't talk to me like this. You can't yell at me like this. We're in a professional meeting and this is not okay. This behavior is not okay. And he stopped. And after the fact, he apologized to her and he hasn't done it since. So that's changing, right? That's changing our response, because normally what she would do is she would, ratchet up her emotional reaction. She would get really defensive or she would completely shut down. Instead, she held her ground. She drew the line in terms of her boundary. Very, very important to work with your boundaries. And she stayed it, and it was productive, and it was productive for their relationship. And it made her feel really powerful in that relationship to know that she could actually do that. And to have gotten to the point where she felt confident to do that, and the fact that she could do that. Okay. And so again, we often say to our clients, remember, when you're looking at someone else's behavior, the most important thing to be saying to yourself is, that's about them. It's not about me, right? Their narcissistic defenses are not about you. Even though they might be their behavior's coming and it feels like it's directed at you, their trigger, their developmental gap, this is about them. So it's about how do we respond, right? And we have choices in that response, and that's what we want to learn, okay? So I'm going to leave you off with just a couple of actions, because we always want to make sure we give you some practical tips. So in addition to checking out more of our videos on Dranitsaris-Hilliard on YouTube, we also have an upcoming podcast series, where we're going to be talking about dysfunction, organizational dysfunction, leadership dysfunction, and of course, narcissism will feature predominantly in some of those conversations. But in addition to that, really start thinking about or go through the process of identifying when those around you are getting triggered to use the narcissistic defenses. So, because that will help you to understand more about their behavior. So again, I know for one of my clients is if he thinks something's going to make him look bad, it's an automatic. It's like 0 to 100 in a heartbeat. So I know that. So I can manage that in my communications. I can manage how I present things. I can manage how I influence things or introduce things to him, right? So again, it's, what is it? Look at those that you're dealing with on a day in, day out basis that use the narcissistic defenses, and start to think about can you identify that trigger? What it is that's going on that again is leading to that. Also, take some time to reflect on your own behavior. Remember, I started off by talking about the fact that this is part of everyday life. And the reason is because we all have defenses and we all will use narcissistic defenses, because again, it's a way of protecting ourselves. And so think about and reflect on where you in your life might be using narcissistic defenses, or coming at things through that lens of the victim or being powerless. So, okay, look at it sort of from both ends of that spectrum. Again, building your awareness around this, building your awareness around your role within it, how you engage in it, and where there may be times that you're pulling it out and working from it. And what might you do differently going forward? As you reflect and you see and you make those observations, consider what you might have done differently in order to not end up in that place, or in order to have a different experience. Practice setting boundaries, right? We encourage all of our clients with this, if they're in a relationship, either at work or in their personal lives, where they really don't have that influence over their behavior from a development perspective, is what are some of the boundaries you have? Is there a limit you place to how long? Is there, I know for my daughter, because she deals with a father who practices narcissistic self-protection, she always brings a friend with her because there's a buffer, and that makes the whole experience more effective. So that's her boundary. She won't do one-on-one, but she will definitely spend time with him as long as there's a second person there with her that acts as a buffer. So those boundaries are about us, because then she doesn't have to feel victimized. Then we don't have to feel powerless, because we're actually figuring out what it is that we need, what's going to work best for us, and we're putting that need forward. Okay. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Remember, if you're catching this video, either here on Facebook or on our YouTube channel, please post your comments, ask your questions, share your stories. We can't wait to hear from you, and stay tuned as we come with over the next few weeks. We're going to be talking more about narcissism in a number of different contexts. So stay tuned, and we look forward to helping you learn really how to thrive when you're dealing with those narcissistic defensive behaviors. Until next time, again, I'm Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard. So glad you joined me here today.